This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
You are actually seeing two forces in play. One is the force where companies are, asking people to come back to work. But then there is another force which we are also seeing, which is greater flexibility in the workplace. So I think what we are probably arriving at is some sort of a new normal that will look a lot more like companies asking people to come back, right? Not for the sake of coming back, but more for the sake of very practical business reasons. But at the same time, taking very deep, hard look that they should also interface and intersperse flexibility. Because if you don't do this, then actually companies run the risk of losing very good talent in their organizations.
Hybrid working seems to have become what was called 2 years ago a new normal by so many commentators. Yet, we're now seeing very high-profile rollbacks of hybrid working from 2 to 3 days in the office to as much as 5 days in office by default. So where is this coming from? That's what we hope to explore in our conversation today. Hello, I'm Tay Hong Yi. You're listening to Headstart On Record, the show that gives the head start to your personal finance and career. Our guest today is an experienced leader of the human resource fraternity with over 20 years of experience in the field across the startup, corporate, and non-governmental organization space. He is Mr. Aslam Sadar, Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Human Resource Professionals, a professional body for human resource practitioners. Welcome to the show, Aslam.
Thank you, Hong Yi, and a pleasure to be here.
So I can't think of anyone who is more well-placed to really situate this shift, or rather this pushback against the general shift towards flexible work over the last few years than you, given your position with the fraternity. So it seems like, to me at least, having covered this for several years, an equilibrium was reached across most industries of a hybrid arrangement of 3 days in office or 2 days in office, give or take. What could cause this wave of some notable employers going all the way back to 5 days in office by default?
I think it's a very good point you just raised in the sense that, an equilibrium was sort of reached with some sort of hybrid arrangements and companies coming out of COVID. But I think perhaps at least in the immediate past term, if you look at some of the impacts around us, there seems to be an amplification of disruptions. I mean, first of all, it was just a few years ago, ChatGPT came out and AI became some sort of a buzzword. Now we are talking about agentic AI or Gen AI. And then you juxtapose that against the recent, geopolitical upheavals that we are seeing that's impacting how businesses are really imagining the world today. I think all this has affected not just countries, but also organizations at a firm-specific level. And companies are starting to really think hard about how are they going to compete in a highly disrupted world and maybe even consider the implication it has to cost. So I think if you look at it and you take a step back and say, if this was the macro environment, then at a micro or the firm-specific level, companies also are starting to ask, how do I transform? How do I start to really think hard about innovation and creativity to compete and differentiate against my competitors? And of course, as they study all this, they invariably will look at costs, right? And I think there are also certain views that if I have all this real estate footprint, then does it make sense for me to keep them empty, right? What is the cost implications for all this? Now, again, the workforce expectations have also changed. If you look at the workforce today, companies are no longer having just 1 or 2 generations. I mean, some companies have up to 5 generations of the workforce. And all this brings a whole new set of expectations, right? More demand for flexibility. So I think it is inevitable that we will see some form of tension between a desire to have some sort of a hybrid work environment versus the pressures that business leaders and employers face to bring more efficiency and productivity into the workplace so that the organization can compete more effectively. But I would say there is one thing that I'm really heartened is that in the recent COS debates, it was reported that actually flexible work arrangement adoptions have seen an increase. And that to me is quite heartening because I think as much as businesses push for a return to office, we're also seeing a greater adoption of flexible arrangements in organizations. So I think the jury is still out, but to me, the fact that there are more flexibility in terms of arrangements for the workers in organizations bodes well, in our workplaces.
So notwithstanding certain prominent names that have given this high-profile rollbacks across the board in the economy, we're looking at a greater availability of these pathways. Even if someone doesn't necessarily qualify, they could at least have a pathway to request for it. That's what it seems like to me. However, what I would like to really explore with you is, do you think that often when this latest wave of rolling back towards 5 days, would you say is more driven by fundamentals, or do kind of perceptions and sentiments by certain senior management also come into it that's maybe not so tied to the fundamentals?
I think the starting premise for me when I think of your comment and your question is pragmatism. Businesses have to compete and they have to survive in a very competitive environment. So naturally, they have to take pragmatic approaches and take rational positions. So I think that to me is the starting premise. And pragmatism will definitely demand that you take very hard look at key variables typical in an organization. I mean, cost being one of them. Are we productive? Are we being innovative? Are we producing new ideas and products for the market so that we can differentiate ourselves from competitors? I think from that standpoint, most businesses will take that approach first. But obviously, they will look around and see, what are others doing? Will they actually follow? My sense is they might observe, but whether or not they follow or take a certain perceived direction because someone else is taking it, really is a function of how they look at their businesses, right? I think every business is different and every business competitive advantage is different. So my own view is that at the end of the day, I would say that businesses have to take very pragmatic decisions and not necessarily just follow the crowd, as it might appear to be.
Yes, but the tone does have shifted a little when you have certain prominent organizations, prominent leaders really much more actively pushing back against it than before, I would suppose. Are you concerned about a potential domino effect? Given that some of these prominent employers, you would know some of the names, let's not go into that, but they've gone back to 5 days, especially in the wake of certain changes, the Trump election, changes in the regulatory environment. Do you think that there's a chance of a domino effect, especially rippling down to Singapore?
I'm not sure if we are going to see a domino effect. And the reason why I say this is because you are actually seeing two forces in play. One is the force where companies are, asking people to come back to work. But then there is another force which we are also seeing, which is greater flexibility in the workplace. So I think what we are probably arriving at is some sort of a new normal that will look a lot more like companies asking people to come back, right? Not for the sake of coming back, but more for the sake of very practical business reasons. But at the same time, taking very deep, hard look that they should also interface and intersperse flexibility. Because if you don't do this, then actually companies run the risk of losing very good talent in their organizations. And I think these are hard questions which business leaders will not shy away from. They will look at it and they will study it and they will come to a very rational conclusion.
So you interact a lot with business leaders, both here and abroad in the course of your work. Where's the conversation at with these leaders in terms of the return to office versus hybrid versus how to intersperse flexibility?
So actually what I'm hearing is less so about return to work. I think that is an effect. But I think the deeper concern in most organizations today is with all the upheavals we are seeing, right? Geopolitically, technologically, how should we compete? How should we stay relevant? How should we make decisions, right? For example, businesses now have to make decisions Do I invest or not invest? If I invest, where should I invest? What is the impact it's going to be for me if I invested and the tariffs actually impact my organizations? So I think a lot of businesses are taking a pause and really studying this issue. I mean, the other thing that I'm hearing is that more CEOs actually want to implement AI in their organization, but that doesn't mean everyone know how to implement it. So again, we need to really study the issue. So actually, businesses are looking at the problems slightly differently. They're more concerned about transformation. They are more concerned about, is my workforce ready for a world where we're going to see a lot more adoption of maybe Gen AI? And I think now there is even talks in the tech world of some form of humanoid robotics coming into the picture, although I think that's still a few years away. But already we are seeing a lot of automations and deployment of very simple robots in day-to-day work is already happening. So I think businesses are really looking at this more intensely as opposed to, demanding that people come back to work.
And of course, this is against the backdrop of this train of thought that if a job can be done fully remote, it does raise the possibility that first, can it be automated and displaced by AI? Second, can it be offshore to the wider market globally? So I think some caution also has to be in place for roles that can be so easily made remote, right? Because these roles are also in this economy, as you mentioned, with some of the challenges in place, also perhaps a bit more precarious than people might imagine them to be.
And I think you brought a very good point, You brought a very good point that if roles that can actually be implemented, remotely, right, or done remotely, then businesses will be thinking hard about, okay, does it make sense? Sometimes it does make sense to actually have, in a highly geographical dispersed type business model, you might want to have more work from home type arrangements. Actually, it really depends. I know of organizations where, because they operate in a country that is very large, it doesn't make sense for you to have an office in a particular location to serve a client. So then it might be better for you to have just one individual working in that location, but home-based. So it really is a function of the business model and the type of services you offer in the market. But you are right. Companies are asking very hard questions about automation, job transformation, job redesign and workplace transformation to see how can they, raise productivity and drive efficiency.
And you also mentioned earlier this point about real estate that actually got me thinking, because you're right, sometimes there are a lot of sunk costs involved in real estate that really might underlie some of the sort of cost considerations that then drive a bit more of the pressure towards back to the office. So I was wondering this about the wider point of it, that are you seeing, I guess, real estate or the kind of office location, office amenities and so on, is it a point of prestige and pride with workers? Is it something that they kind of weigh a bit into the employer brand or the perception of the employer brand?
I think for some organizations, they do. They do take, for example, the layout, the way they design the office experience quite seriously. And increasingly, you are seeing organizations, perhaps the larger one and the more progressive ones, take a hard look at real estate, not necessarily in a single office, but maybe in a multiple office location. How do I provide flexibility for the workforce? For example, I've heard and I've spoken to some organizations where, yes, they do have a main office, but they also offer options working with co-working spaces where a staff can actually just walk into a co-working space, do their work for a few hours, and then proceed either to the next meeting or proceed to, back to the office. So it really depends, right? So I think there's a lot more variability, diversity today when we think of office spaces and the concept behind office spaces and how that impacts the workers' experience, the brand positioning that an organization wants to convey to prospective talents when, they want to pursue.
And I imagine against this whole backdrop of will we or will we not return to the office, real estate then becomes a very important lever, because if people want to must return 5 days, I guess they'll be a lot happier returning 5 days to a very, very nice environment.
And not just that, right? Yeah, not just a nice environment, a pleasant environment, but one where you might actually have a workspace that you can operate in. So I think companies have to think hard about their choices. If you do want your workers to come back, you have to think hard about your real estate, your spaces that you're making available
not
for
to mention
people
the
to come
broader
back.
experience as well.
Of course, broader experience too.
Yeah. Yeah, so clearly it's not just about a single policy, you just plug and change the mandate, but there are a lot of other things that have to change downstream and upstream of it.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, Everything relates, right? I mean, if I make a decision to bring people back, I have to think of many other consequences and many other issues that you need to take into considerations. And I would say it is moments like this that, when business leaders make these kind of decisions, they have to sit down with their HR counterpart to say, okay, what is the impact to the workers and the workforce, right? And if you want to drive productivity, then you must pay attention to some of these experiences that workers have.
Is that the way the conversation is being laid out right now in your experience? Because I can imagine you have been dealing with some organizations that, whether due to a perceived need or an actual need, they do need to roll it back towards 4 or 5 days in office. Is that the way they think through it, or are there still certain kind of gaps?
So from the organizations I speak to, actually they do. And in fact, there are some organizations, HR is actually leading that process, right? When you think of office redesign, it's not necessarily the work of just the person in charge of, managing all the facilities, but actually HR as part of the team, right, of people that is involved in, co-curating and thinking through. I know one organization, I will refrain from mentioning the name, but I know one organization where a HR leader was very proactively involved in designing the entire renovation of the office so that it ensures that the workers' experience is enhanced. But again, they are in a space where talent is a premium. And because talent is a premium, you must make sure that you have all these little nuances taken care of.
So, in your experience, are you seeing organizations that find that they inevitably have to cut back? Does it hurt employee engagement and kind of attractiveness of the employer?
I think employee engagement and employer attraction has many, many variables impacting it. Return to work is just but one of the variables. I mean, how the managers interface and interact with the staff, how you actually design your compensation and benefit, is actually a form of attraction, right, to a certain segment of the workforce. And then how you treat your workers, the culture you have in an organization. So I won't be too fast to say that, return to work will have a big and outsized impact on employee engagement or employee attraction. But I'd say it is now increasingly a consideration, right, for workers, because if you look at the workforce today, there are many demands being placed on the workforce, right? For example, those of a certain age may need to take care of their parents, but also have child caring needs. So a degree of flexibility will be demanded. You have a certain segments of the population or workforce population where they feel that, actually, I prefer to go back to work, right? Because home is too much of a distraction. So I think if you really think hard about this, it really boils down to flexibility, giving people options. And if you want to attract people and engage the workforce, providing that sort of options will make you, perhaps a more attractive employer.
So the return to office should be just one of several other options, really.
I believe so. And I believe at the end of the day, and I go back to an earlier point I make, right? Flexibility is key. The workforce is diverse. There are many more generations. Expectations have changed. And I think companies have to think hard about how to infuse flexibility if they make a decision to bring workers back to the office.
You're right that this is one of several other considerations, and this is probably a bit ironic of me to say it, that because given how much media coverage there is, certain big organizations, the fixation on the return to 5 days, regardless of what is surrounding it, that does suggest to me perhaps it's still quite high on the list. It may not be the only thing, but my sense from the coverage and the reactions of it is that it's still pretty high on the list. Is that what we're seeing in Singapore as well?
I think I will look at it slightly differently. What comes out in the media perhaps is the very obvious headline, return to office. But there might be several levels of nuance that we don't see, right? And I think it is the nuance that is very important. So I'll give you an example. We often think that, flexible work arrangements has to be very structured. Actually, not so, There is informal ways to give flexibility. So, for example, one of the things I learned when I was part of the tripartite work group that looked at flexible work arrangements was that SME owners have always been giving flexibility to their workforce. It's just that it is informal, not necessarily in a formal process, black and white. So I think we have to look at the headline in a more nuanced way and maybe double or triple click down to see how organizations are implementing flexibility within a mandate for people to come back to the office. So I know of companies where, in IHRP alone, one of the things we practice is if you need some flexibilities for, say, less than 3 months, actually it's informal, you can just discuss it with your supervisor and informally the person can apply and you have your flexibility. And flexibility is not necessarily, by the way, working from home. It is also telecommuting, it's differentiated timing. So, but if you need something more structured, more long-term, right, then naturally fill in the paperwork, we will evaluate, and then after that, we will see how does that fit. And also, you discuss with the staff and say, okay, these are my expectations. So I think there's a lot more nuance, and I would say headlines may cause alarm, but it may not necessarily be so if you double or triple click down.
Yes, and it's very organizationally specific. So on that point, and since you raised that point about what employees can do in your own organization as well, perhaps would you have any tips for employees who have been working very long in a hybrid arrangement and then now their organization tells them that by default there's a return to the office 5 days a week? How should they react to this? How should they navigate this if they find the prior arrangement is something works very well for them? Because clearly it can't be that, they should just resign and go, right? There are certain things that they should probably explore, certain avenues, but maybe what are some of the avenues to consider?
That's a very good question, and I can just imagine if you have been in a hybrid environment for some time, suddenly coming back to work every day will definitely impact the individual, because
it could be too drastic to just resign right away because of it.
And I agree, and I think if the individual adopts the approach that because of this I'm going to quit, it will be quite a regret, and I'll explain why. By and large, companies are run by managers, right? And managers themselves are people. I think what is important is you must start with conversations, right? If it's too quick and too drastic, I would suggest that the workers or the individuals affected sit down with the manager, maybe involve your HR if there's a HR department, to explain your considerations, why you may need some time. Better still, if you actually do need flexibility, there is the tripartite guidelines for flexible work arrangements, right? You can invoke that. Yeah, request.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Thanks for the correction. Right? Make the request and request perhaps in a more structured way for you to still maintain that hybrid work if that works for you. Obviously, if that is rejected by your firm, then sit down with them to work out a plan on how you can gradually come back, because you may have certain commitments that you need to exit from, right? And that will take time. But be open, keep an open mind. And don't forget, at the end of the day, trust is very important, because you must demonstrate a certain degree of trust to your employers to say that, look, if I really want the hybrid arrangements, you can trust me to be able to deliver on all my promises and performance expectations while working from home, right? So I think start with conversations, build trust, keep it open-minded. And I think when you do that, you can find middle grounds.
I like what you're saying there, Aslam, because I think there are 2 points that can be elicited from it. The first point is that even though there might be an overarching mandate towards 5 days, maybe specific workflows may have a higher tolerance of hybrid still, notwithstanding the general mandate, which, of course, for ease of administration and all that, you would have a default, right, to work with. And the second point is that what it seems like is that individuals need to also keep a more open mind as to the options that are available. It might not be that they would be able to retain hybrid within that specific job role, but there might be adjacent job roles, adjacent deployments, for example.
Actually, you brought up a really good point, because depending on the organizations you work for example, if you work for a large enough organization, internal mobility could be an option. So you could potentially discuss with your HR and your supervisor and say, maybe you want to move to another role or another department that can offer you that flexibility, right? As opposed to taking that assertive step to say, okay, I'm going to leave the organization, which I feel could be a real pity, because today I think in the workplace, yes, you can leave an organization, but you also have to really evaluate what is the trade-off you are making, right? What are the competencies and skills you might have acquired while still remaining in your organization, trading that off for another, and potentially taking the risk of whether or not that new organization you join can offer you the same kind of opportunities for growth. I think it's always it's a very complex decision for an individual to make. So I would say, if you are on comfortable ground, find opportunities within that same ground rather than take a drastic step.
Thanks for that, Aslam. I think that's a great note, actually, a very helpful guidance to end off this podcast on. I'm Tay Hong Yi, and if you have any questions or personal stories to share about your own experience, either with flexible work arrangements or with dealing with an impending return to office, do reach out to us, and you can find our contact details in the podcast show notes. Links to my articles, the Headstart newsletter, or my LinkedIn profile can all be found there too. This podcast episode is edited by Amirul Karim. Thanks for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening. Do note, all analyses, opinions, recommendations, and other information in this podcast are for general information purposes only and are not intended to be relied upon as financial advice. You should not rely on them in making any decision. Please consult a fully qualified financial advisor or professional expert for independent advice and verification. To the fullest extent permitted by law, SPH Media shall not be liable for any loss arising from the use of or reliance on any analyses, opinions, recommendations, and other information in this podcast. SPH Media accepts no responsibility or liability whatsoever that may result or arise from the products, services, or information of any third parties. All opinions expressed by participants in this podcast are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of SPH Media.